Welcome to Reading the Room, a literary podcast featuring author interviews and discussions with bookish content creators. I'm your host, Jalen, and today I am so excited to be joined by Maggie Millner, author of Couplets, out today from FSG Books. Couplets is a book that I'm going to be recommending incessantly this year, so if you're a frequent listener of the podcast or watch my YouTube channel, get ready for me to be quite annoying about this book. I apologize in advance, but it is incredibly seductive and interesting and playing with form and doing everything that the bar in the bookcase and Reading the Room loves to talk about, and so I have to keep recommending it to you. Maggie Millner is a lecturer at Yale and is a senior editor at the Yale Review, and this is her first book. Her poems have appeared in the New Yorker, the Paris Review, Kenyon Review, Bomb, The Nation, and elsewhere. This is also my first discussion talking about poetry directly. I've talked to poets before, but this is in huge part a book containing poems. So that is a first Reading the Room. And to give you a brief synopsis of what this book is about, Couplets is a dazzling love story in poems about one woman's coming out, coming of age, and coming undone. A woman lives an ordinary life in Brooklyn. She has a boyfriend. They share a cat. She writes poems in the prevailing style, but she also has dreams of being seduced by a throng of older women, of kissing a friend in a dorm room closet. But the dreams are private, not real. One night, she meets another woman at a bar, and an escape hatch swings open in the floor of her life. She falls into a consuming affair, into queerness, polyamory, kink, power and loss, humiliation and freedom, and an enormous surge of desire that lets her leave herself behind. Maggie Millner's captivating, seductive debut is a love story in poems that explores obsession, gender, identity, and the art and act of literary transformation. In rhyming couplets and prose vignettes, Couplets chronicles the strictures, structures, and pitfalls of relationships, the mirroring, the pleasing, the small jealousies and disappointments, and how the people we love can show us who we truly are. This is a masterpiece of form, of theory, of blending prose and poetry, criticism, all in a blender, and also giving you a very sexy and intimate book that's perfect for Valentine's Day. This discussion was incredible. I could listen to Maggie talk all day, and I think you're going to really enjoy it. Please go out and get Couplets today. It's available now. And if you read it, let me know what you think. If you enjoy Reading the Room and would like to support the podcast with a donation, I have a Patreon, which is patreon.com/readingtheroom, which contains two support tiers. One is $3 and one is $5. Your support means the world to me, so thank you so much to all who have joined the Patreon already. Let's get into the interview. Maggie, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
I am stoked to dive into this book because I have so many questions about its form, about what you're doing with poetry generally too. I think you're my first poet at your core on the podcast, so I think that'll be really fun to dive into those questions because I'm a little bit less well versed in it, I guess.
Wonderful. Well, I am truly a poet at my core.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell. I mean, you dive deep into couplets in this book, which is really interesting, and I have many questions about that structure because I found it really fascinating in this book too. But before we even get into that, I wanted to start with the epigraph of the book, which is a quote from Edna St. Vincent Millay, I believe is how you say her name, from a poem called Love Is Not All. And in this epigraph, it is really exploring this idea of love as something to suffer for, a need that does not satisfy certain human necessities such as food or sleep, etc. But then the poem is still considering how vital love is for the speaker, despite that. And then when I was going back over my notes and going back through my highlights and stuff, I noticed something near the end of the book, which is really interesting. There's a quote in which the narrator of Couplets talks about the different requirements of love in poetry versus prose. And the narrator states, "In poetry, then, let me say that love has been, above all things, the engine of self-knowledge in my life. And even after everything, is still what makes the rest worth suffering." So just to tee that up, I wanted to ask you about the epigraph and what that means for you in writing this book.
Well, I love that question. Well, Edna St. Vincent Millay, I'll say, is a really, I think, appropriate kind of lodestar for the book. She was a figure who kind of had a wild little social life in Greenwich Village. Her first kind of entree into the literary world was through a poem in rhyming couplets, Renaissance, which is this like kind of wild spiritual journey about someone kind of like passing out on a field of grass and looking at the sky and having an out of body experience in which they are buried and dead and then coming back to life and in a totally renewed way. So I love her. She's this wild poet who doesn't get read enough, I think. Today she was also very sexually promiscuous. She had sex with women and men. She was really ahead of her time in so many ways and is a certain kind of, I think, hedonistic or kind of anarchic figure in the poetry world. So I really, it was a treat to find this poem and to recognize the resonances between what I was working on and this sonnet of hers, which of course does end in a rhyming couplet, and to kind of find that as the epigraph felt very fortuitous. It felt really, really perfect. And I didn't find that epigraph until I was working with a couple different epigraphs and wasn't even sure that I necessarily wanted or needed an epigraph since there's so much quotation within the poems themselves, within the poem itself. Like it wasn't clear to me that the appropriate thing was to have some separate quote, that's not integrated into the text. But actually, when I found this poem, I thought, or reread this poem, I guess I'd probably read it long ago, but when I came upon it, it was very clear to me that it needed to be the epigraph. Um, yeah, and I think what she's kind of arguing in that poem, there's a kind of proclamation in that poem of being a real romantic, of being someone at the end of the day who's really committed to the transformative potential of love, even as suffering and and heartache and change and loss are also kind of endemic to the experience of love. She's still saying in that poem, and I would do it all again. I am actually really committed to romantic love, as as one of the fundamental ways that we relate to other people, and perhaps that we also relate to ourselves and learn about ourselves. So I just I felt a real kind of kinship with her when I was reading that. Yeah, and the simplicity of that final sentence, the epigraph ends. She's saying like, maybe I will be tempted, and perhaps there's some reality in which like I could go back in time and have an easier life and renounce all these experiences I've had romantically, and do it differently. And then the epigraph ends with the simple kind of monosyllabic chain of words. I do not think I would. And I just love that.
Yeah, I loved reading it in full too. When I was prepping for this, it was really interesting to
Mhm.
see that reference. It was really interesting going back to it and reflecting on what this book did, because it was really like, I feel like this sounds kind of wild, but it does feel like a very transformative experience when you're reading this. Like I didn't expect like where this book was going. I didn't really. It was just so surprising and so inventive on every single page that I was so struck by it. And one thing too that initially kind of primed me to what was going to come is just the structure of the book generally, in terms of a proem, four books, and then, or four parts, I guess, and then a coda.
Mhm.
I wanted to ask you, before we talk about couplets as a form, how you landed on this sort of six-part structure for the book.
Great question. I think the process of writing the book was really, I wrote each individual section, or I'll say each individual kind of numbered chunk. There are 50 total, right? There's the poem, there's the coda, and then there's 12 in each of the four sections. And I wrote the fancy poetry word for that would be like canto, right? Those are the, the cantos. So I wrote each of those kind of cantos or little sections pretty individually, as if they were each a kind of individual lyric poem. And then, so I had a sort of collection of these sections. I knew they all fit into a larger work or a larger structure, but it wasn't clear to me for a really long time how exactly, whether that was a strictly kind of chronological narrative, or whether this would end up being actually a much more traditional collection of poems, that maybe have some thematic resonances with each other, but you know jump around a little bit more, don't really cohere necessarily into a holistic story. After I'd written maybe, I don't know, 20 to 30 of these, it felt like, oh, wait, no, I'm up to something a little bit different here. I'm writing a fairly novelistic, actually, account of a really kind of transformative chapter in this character's life. And once I'd kind of hit on that, and I kind of and I had a critical mass of these pieces, then I started to really think about structure and about how to kind of approach the project maybe a little bit more as a prose writer or a novelist might, rather than as a poet might in certain ways. And so then I started reading some long poems. I started reading some verse novels and looked back on some longer poems from kind of the confessional and modernist periods, and got really excited by the idea of having a single story that was broken into kind of chronological chunks. The proem and the coda, I think, preamble poem and then the kind of final outro kind of poem, those feel like they're in a slightly different register, right? There's a kind of formality to them. They sort of invite the reader into what the project is going to be, and then kind of offer a certain maybe resolution at the end. Those felt like they're these kind of old-fashioned, proms. Proms accompanied lots of long poems in kind of the 19th and 20th centuries. And so I kind of liked the nod to that tradition of kind of this introductory poem, this poem that kind of lays out the stakes of the piece for the reader, and that kind of harks back to maybe a different time in literary history. But yeah, the four parts kind of announce themselves. It's more or less chronological. It felt in the end kind of natural in terms of the length of the piece to break it into those particular sections.
Yeah, and what's interesting and what I'm hearing you saying too here is something that I caught on while reading this book is that it's so preoccupied with thinking about different forms, whether it's the couplet, whether this is, a collection of poems versus something more novelistic. And I think what I love the most about this book is how it's playing with all those things and doing its own version of that and sort of using it as like this capacious form to kind of do whatever it wants to do while still sticking to some sort of like rigid structures, whether it's using the 12 poems or pieces in each
Mhm,
book, the core of the book and the title, which is a couplet, and
mhm.
what couplets mean for you and how you made that decision to write many of the poems in that form.
Yeah. I mean, I think part of what we're talking about is this dance that the book is doing, and that I'm maybe doing more broadly in my work, between these notions of constraint and freedom, perhaps. Like this idea of taking a really prescriptive genre, a really prescriptive set of kind of generic tropes, and applying that to one's own work, but also departing in individualized ways from those tropes, right? So we have so many literary conventions, we have so many expectations as readers, especially in the 21st century, of what a particular text that's marketed or that's labeled in a particular way is supposed to do for us, right? What it's supposed to give us, how it's supposed to proceed temporally, how it's supposed to appear formally. And those conventions, I think, as I was writing, felt felt important to play with, right? Felt like in some ways they gave me this feeling of connectedness to other writers and to literary traditions that I feel very indebted to, and also felt perhaps constraining in a way that doesn't have nothing to do with the other kinds of constraint that the book is exploring, right? Constraint in relationships. The point is, the couplet as a form, it came to feel like a kind of relationship. If this is a book that is so much about exploring partnership and the forms that relationships take, the couplet felt in some ways like this really perfect and, again, sort of like fortuitous vessel for those kinds of conversations, or those kinds of themes, right? It's a form that has a duality kind of built into it, right? A rhyme suggests a kind of two-part correspondence, right? There's a suggestion that, the two rhyming words are not unlike two people who see things about themselves mirrored in the other, right? There's also a kind of broader thing about form, which is that it's really grounding to have a prescribed way to go about writing. Like, it's really helpful, especially when what you're experiencing and what you're describing is really confusing and disorienting and unclear, and indeterminate. It's what an amazing thing to know, okay, every line has to be somewhere in the ballpark of 5 metrical feet. It has to end with a word that will be rhymed in the next line. There's something so, I think, comforting in a certain way about hewing to a really kind of constraining, tight, prescriptive form. What this book describes is an experience of leaving a really kind of conventional life, a life that is really defined by a lot of kind of heteronormative ideas, right? There's this idea of the monogamous marriage to a cis man being sort of the obvious kind of terminus of this life, right? Like that adulthood necessarily entails a certain kind of codependency in that way with that kind of person and that kind of relationship. It's a story of radically surprising oneself, of finding that that form really doesn't suit this narrator, and that she wants a freer and less prescribed, I think, form for her life, but at the same time has kind of very little idea of what that might be, or how what that shape might look like. Yeah, I think in the absence of those kinds of conventions, right? As she's kind of breaking free of all of these expectations, the couplet form arrives as a way to orient her on this journey. It's a way to really organize thought. And it's a way to offer a kind of structure and a sense of predictability and a sense of linguistic kinds of expectations, right? Imposed formal constraints that really, I think, feel helpful at this point in this speaker's life. She also importantly, I think, as she tended to, as this character tends to in lots of different situations, when the constraint starts to feel too overly prescriptive or too familiar or too narrow, suddenly she feels like defying it, right? She needs to depart from it. She's a character who's very much kind of vacillating between wanting to be constrained and wanting the safety and the predictability that prescribed forms provide, and also being a really kind of defiant and really kind of resolutely independent kind of thinker for whom those forms fail all the time. So I think the couplet, there's something really beautiful about the ways that couplets allow for a certain kind of, certainly for the reader, a certain kind of predictability and a certain kind of formal structure, but also there's so many slant rhymes, there's so many imperfect rhymes, there's so many moments of where the rhymes feel kind of more oblique, or where the rhymes are jettisoned altogether, right? And she kind of jumps into prose. On the one hand, it's this almost outdated or antiquated form, but on the other hand, and taking a sort of more fluid maybe approach to it. And so it really was helpful to kind of have that independence, to kind of take what I wanted to take from these conventions, and also to have this sense of really robust kind of literary history, and to be in conversation with all of these coupletiers from the last several centuries of English literature, to have them kind of in my ear at the same time.
So my favorite passage in this entire book is 1.8. It's just simply like perfect to me. I read it, like I kept reading on repeat when I was initially reading the book. I could talk to you about this section probably this entire time. I'll try to be succinct about what I'm trying to say here. I think it's interesting how in this section the narrator reverts to prose, and she's considering in the second person of writing this account of her experience with this woman as being truer to the spirit of that time. And then moving down the passage further, she talks about how experiences don't necessarily belong to people. They were always the outcome of forces beyond the strictly personal, and only became art in the moment they were made available, if in an altered form, to someone new. And from there, it sort of dives deeper into some other writers and thinking about, I guess, quote unquote, autofictional texts and what that means to write about the self in this form. And so I guess all of this to say, the couplet is also working, as a mirror or as this kind of symbol of a parallel for her and trying to understand herself through her relationship with her ex-boyfriend and also the new girlfriend. But
Mhm.
ultimately, it's this excavation of herself and how is she trying to tie her experience in literary form by looking to others, looking to different structures and all of this. And so I think 1.8 is the perfect kind of synthesis of that inquiry. And so I wanted to ask you about your craft of that passage and what that means for you.
I'm so happy that that resonated with you. It's the first moment in the book where this kind of more analytical register, I think, enters. The narrator, the speaker, kind of stops telling the story in a way she's sort of self-interrupting in that moment. She's wondering if the way she's telling the story is right at all, and if in fact maybe there's some other form that is more endemic to this experience, or a kind of narratorial position that's more appropriate to the experience or more representative of the experience. It felt risky in a way to include that kind of meta commentary alongside perhaps the more like delicious and plotty parts of the book. So it makes me really happy that you were struck by that particular passage. It's really nice to hear. I have so many things to say about this. I'll start with, I think we make certain assumptions when we are reading works by women, when we're reading works by queer people, and when we're reading works by poets, right? I think readers of all of those categories of writer, I think, project a lot of kind of autobiographical writing onto them, right? I think especially contemporary poets writing with a kind of lyric eye, their work is interpreted in general mostly as kind of like straight nonfiction, which of course it's not. It's no more nonfiction than, I mean, unless it's sort of announcing itself that way. But it's an interesting assumption, and I think it's one I really wanted to push back on, partly because I believe in respecting the artifice, respecting the production of these narratives as an artistic endeavor. When we assume that someone is writing, I don't know, diaristically or autobiographically in some unmediated way, we are, I think, interpreting the literary art more as a pretext for the biography of the person than as aesthetic object that transcends that person. And I think we relate to different categories of people. I think we're much more likely to kind of make that assumption, or treat a work that way when it's written by, historically, when it's written by a woman, or when it's written by a queer person, or when it's written by a contemporary poet, right? So I wanted on some level to push back against those ideas. So that's sort of one part of it. I think on the other hand, we have a relationship contemporarily to autofiction that reproduces some of those assumptions and mistakes on the reader's side, that I also kind of want to play with, which is that autofiction might be a kind of faddish trend to kind of talk about it in literary critical circles, but it's certainly nothing new. And in fact, as I say, I think in that poem, it's approximately as old as literature itself, right? The idea of taking experiences from one's lived history, embroidering them, transforming them into artifice in some kind of surprising way, that's mostly what we're doing as writers, right? I feel protective of our ability to do that work without the assumption, I don't know, that it's less creative or less imaginative if those experiences that are being described have some tether in our experienced reality, have some connection to, real history. Factuality is also, it's such a contested thing in literature to begin with, right? I mean, in memoir and personal essay, right? Those are huge literary fads of the last couple decades. Even in those works, I think it's very clear to a generous sort of reader that a lot of what is being described is subjective, is taken from perhaps an imperfect memory or internal record of events, and that what we get when we're interacting with literary narrative is an account, is a story or set of experiences that has as much to do with art making and formal play and the kinds of transformation that occur when you apply language to anything as they do with factual reality, right? In the gesture, I thought, as I was writing that, is this a kind of defensive gesture to kind of flag these readerly assumptions and to, in some ways, ask my readers not to approach this book this way? There's a section that kind of responds to this, to 1.8 in the fourth section of the book, where the narrator kind of returns to these questions and decides, no, you know what? I don't think this is motivated only by a sense of privacy or a sense of defensiveness. I think it's also motivated by a real respect for the impulse to commit experiences to language, and that's not necessarily always, I think it can be, but I don't think there's anything necessarily only self-serving or self-aggrandizing or self-mythologizing about the impulse to metabolize experience in language and to make art out of it.
This is like my favorite question, and it's so awesome hearing your perspective on it because I was so inquisitive while reading it because like I loved how there's a couple of quotes that I wrote down from this that I love too. The narrator says a peculiar kind of literalism had taken a hold, which I think is such a very succinct, like cool way of describing that, because I do think the book is really also questioning this idea of narrativity generally and why we go to stories to understand things. And when the relationship between a reader and writer becomes, from the book, transactional or didactic, there's a weird thing that's being placed on the book and the expectation of it that is really well explored here. And from there, using the second person telling in those sections, it also allows the narrator to sort of transcend herself. And so my next question I wanted to ask you about is this idea of transcendence and the narrator looking at herself through this text and what this idea of mirroring and transcendence means, I guess, in this form.
There's a quote toward the end of the book about the limitations of kind of the romance novel, which comes from Vivian Gornick, her essay, The End of the Novel of Love. She argues, I think very persuasively, contemporary readers of fiction especially don't believe or don't find credible the narrative that, you meet someone and you go through the intrigues of flirtation and seduction, and then you arrive at some resolution after which you live happily ever after, right? That's like not, we know too much about about human subjectivity, and we are also living after the era of women's liberation, and we don't believe that narrative quite as much as maybe readers did a couple centuries ago. And I think I'm playing with that, or I think I'm interested in the question of, okay, who is the object of the kind of central love story of this book? And I think ultimately, of course, as you're suggesting, it is the self, right? This is an experience that is deeply interpersonal and that involves deep, and I think really actually kind of shockingly to this narrator, deeply profound experiences of intimacy and of kind of self-transcendence with another person. And also, I think ultimately the kind of durable relationship described here is with the self, right? The relationship that sustains through all of these relationships, through all of these romantic encounters, is the relationship to the self. I don't want to foreclose any readings for my readers. I don't want to tell people how to read this book, but for me, it does feel like she arrives ultimately at a place of kind of non-arrival. That is epiphanic and revelatory a place to arrive as any, right? That in fact, what happens over the course of this book is a kind of stripping away of narrative expectations, right? Stripping away of these expectations that, okay, I'm going to figure out what my sexuality is, and I'm going to arrive at a relationship that is immune to change, and I'm going to be able to have a kind of non-fluid, really structured and predictable relationship with myself that sustains across time. like that I think to this character seems more and more dubious as she grows up in a certain way, right? If we take that as as a given, right? If we accept that for people interested in asking these questions, for people interested in asking questions about gender, about sexuality, about relationship models, for people who are really kind of diving into those conventions and interested in queering them and warping them and modifying them to suit our lives, like the work is never over. We don't stop asking the questions. We don't arrive at some finished conclusive identity or relationship to these ideas that allows us to kind of, wash our hands and stop asking. And if we take that as the assumption, then ultimately what this is a record of, what literature maybe is a record of more generally is that journey, or that a slice of experiences that doesn't necessarily involve, arriving at some final place, but that maybe gives readers some sense of solace and some sense of connection as they kind of go through some of these same transformations or some of these same phases of disaffection and disillusionment and intimacy and these kind of cyclical journeys that we're all on to some extent. So yeah, I think ultimately it is about cultivating, a relationship to yourself. It is about cultivating a relationship to yourself that feels like it can sustain all of the transformations that will inevitably happen over the course of your life in a way.
It's interesting to think about too in this book how much the narrator is informed by other, work as well, and different ideas of
Mhm.
theory and how those are incorporated into her own thinking. And I feel like this book, in future work that I might read, I can very easily seeing this being, referenced in another book that, in a similar way, which I think is really beautiful and goes to what you were just speaking about in terms of how it can inform people's lives and kind of a more realistic way of tying to someone's, self-searching or identity. So I wanted to ask you about the general ideas of theory in this book and the references to other work throughout. Did they arise with the ideas presented at each poem, or did you kind of catalog them before? Could you speak on that?
It's a really good question. I think it was different for different quotations or different writers. There were a couple. The Vivian Gornick is a good example that were quotes or ideas that had kind of been I'd been sitting with, or that had kind of been circulating for me for a while. But a lot of them actually, a lot of the quotations and a lot of the references that appear in the book were genuine records of an encounter I was having as I was writing. So they weren't necessarily quotes I'd had kind of stored away and was waiting for an appropriate time to bring them out. I was reading really widely as I was writing, and it felt kind of organic to weave some of those writers and thinkers into the writing I was doing. I think also the narrator is clearly someone who's looking for answers, right? Or who's very much on a like self-investigative journey. And so this idea of reading widely and of searching in other texts, and especially texts by women and queer writers, I think that feels very true to the textures of her experience, right? She's also probably reading widely and is so kind of ravenous for wisdom and for knowledge from people she respects or people who might have figured this out before her. So I think a lot of them arrived kind of organically through the reading I was doing. I'll say also there are a lot of references to kind of not super highbrow things. There's a lot of like pop music and songs and bands and things that I was maybe listening to or could imagine this character maybe listening to that I think are woven also kind of organically. I wanted to be kind of omnivorous or kind of just like inclusive about including these details that are just like really part of the texture of everyday life for someone who's a listener of music and a reader, a wide reader, and someone who's kind of like walking around the streets of Brooklyn with her headphones on, feeling sort of confused a lot of the time.
Yeah, I loved reading those references. And I mean, I know I've asked you like a ton of, very technical crafts questions. One aspect I haven't touched on here is how, I guess, for lack of a better word, like spicy or sexy this book is as well. And I had this
Thank you.
quote that I've been saving for an interview, just about sex writing generally. And so the question basically is about how you think about it. But I wanted to sort of start it off with this quote from Melissa Febos from her book Bodywork that I think is really interesting, and maybe it'll spark something as well. But it basically is, when it comes to sex scenes, the rules say things like don't write them at all, and if you do, don't use these words. Don't write them silly, porny, dramatic, tragic, pathological, grim, or ridiculous. My whole practical thesis around the craft of writing a sex scene is this: it is exactly the same as any other scene. And so I'm wondering if you resonate with that at all, or just any ideas you have about the more sexy moments, I guess, in this book.
I love that. I guess I feel a little bit like Melissa Febos, where it feels to me like the project of every scene is is getting it right, capturing some kind of particularity, the kind of like deep particularity of the scene in a way that might resonate for a reader. I mean, and that's a different question, right? When the lived particularity is like, or the like lived experience of that moment is one of being like aroused and titillated, right? So that's a different it's a different kind of experience you're trying to transmit for the reader. But the craft question is sort of applies the same way it does to any other kind of scene, where you're like, okay, here's what I'm seeing, here's what I'm feeling, or here's what I can imagine, this character seeing and feeling. How can I, in as fresh and realistic and kind of like humanized a way as I can, make that available to the reader and also like facilitate that experience for the reader. It was a very sexy time in my life. So I think it felt very natural to just include a lot of scenes of sex. I think sex is also in this book, these erotic encounters. These are moments of huge personal insight for this character. Like this is information, right? If this person is having this transformative, spiritualized sexual encounter, especially of a kind that she maybe hasn't had before, like that's information. That's you can't unknow that once you've experienced that, right? And why would you want to? Also, right? I mean, it's like these are some of the most profoundly embodied and like rich and beautiful moments that I think we are allotted as like living human people. Garth Greenwell, I think, is really good on this too. His books are also very sexy, but they're also very interested in like writing sex in this way that is really both really precise, but also I think really captures the way that sex functions as information in our lives and the kinds of emotional, psychological, spiritual dimensions that different kinds of sexual encounters can afford us. So I guess that's what I'd say is there's a poem in the, I believe, the fourth section of the book where the narrator talks about being in high school, and she said, in adolescence, I had sex the same way I did everything, with a rabid, abstract interest in experience and how the forces it encompassed had evolved. Right. So there's this also very kind of analytic. I mean, this is a very analytical person, right? This is a very analytical approach to experience. There's this like desire, I think, to experience all kinds of things, right? Including maybe especially sex, and then to kind of like think about it and to kind of like understand what it means and to kind of apply it to her understanding of life and human experience.
Thank you for entertaining that question. I've had it saved like in my general archive of questions. I guess the last question I have for you, I always ask every author this, is just for some general book recommendations, meaning like a recent favorite or also like a book you're looking forward to perhaps. This book references one of my favorites, Middlemarch, and I love that reference contained in there. So I'm just curious to know like what you're reading.
Well, everyone should read Middlemarch at least once, I think, probably.
I agree.
Um, it's a romp and also very just kind of mind-blowing on the sentence level. I'm really excited about Catherine Lacey's new book, which I just got an advanced copy of, the autobiography of X. I'm just a couple pages in, and I'm really really excited about it. I'm reading a lot of poetry criticism and kind of poetry manifestos from the past, which may or may not be of interest to anyone other than me. But there's this amazing book by a critic named Anna Hübner called Keats's Odes, A Lover's Discourse. I believe that's the title, which is a really amazing work of its criticism, its literary theory, and it's also deeply interwoven in the kind of style of Barthes, A Lover's Discourse, with personal and subjective kind of readerly responses. It's a beautiful and really kind of genius book. There's a chapbook that came out a few months ago from a little press called The Song Cave by Ben Lerner with paintings in it. Also, I haven't had a chance to talk to anyone about it yet, but it's so good. It's actually so wonderful, and it's in a very limited edition. But I'm having an amazing time with that. And then I'll plug two books of really good books of poems by friends. Bluest Nude by Ama Kojo, which came out a couple months ago and is just a gorgeous collection. And also the book Togetherness by the poet Wo Chan. Wo is doing just amazing things with sonnets and talking about kind of contemporary queer life and gender performance. And the poems are just really stunning, and everyone should pick up that book immediately.
Thank you for sharing those. They'll all be on the TBR as well. And I actually have the Catherine Lacey right here. I'm reading it right now. I'm like halfway through it, and I'm talking to her on Friday. So
Amazing.
I'm very excited. It's
Amazing.
incredible. I think you'll love it too. It's doing a lot of interesting things with like history, and yeah, it's really fun. But thank you for all of those recs, and also just thank you for coming on. This has been such a treat for me. I've been so excited to talk to you ever since finishing this book. I think fans of this podcast will love it. It's such like it's so attuned to my interests, and I just had a blast with it. And also hearing you speak about it was just such an honor. So thank you, Maggie. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Jalen. It was such a pleasure to be here.
Thanks, everyone.